Hello, and welcome to my series on obscure vintage electronics companies. You'll be joining me in going down the rabbit hole of these companies in the search to archive everything they have to offer. There's a lot of places where artists and engineers were able to express their passions that have long since been forgotten. In these videos, I plan to discuss everything known on the topic, alongside what the current research and archival efforts have led us to, and what still needs to be found. I have a lot of fun jumping into obscure stuff that nobody's properly documented before, so I hope I can bring that same passion to you through this series. Let's introduce you to the star of today's episode. His name is Toppo, and he was released by Androbot Inc. in May of 1983. He stands about 3 feet tall and was one of the first programmable home robots on the market. He could speak, move around, and be controlled by an Apple II computer to do whatever you wanted. He wasn't pre-built with any programs, as he was meant for computer hobbyists to experiment with.
Hello, would you like a cup of tea?
That's very kind of you, thank you very much.
I'm a phone robot. I can speak.
Now, Toppo does not actually qualify as a robot. It can execute commands and do physical actions, but it cannot actually sense anything to dynamically interact with its environment. It cannot even calibrate its own motors to ensure the tasks it's doing are accurate, and must require manual adjusting over time. That's what makes it a fun experimentation toolkit, however, as you can be the one to add your own components and sensors to it. The entire hardware is only situated at the bottom, with the rest of the body free to modify and implement with new components. There's also the fun challenge of working with a blind and deaf robot. You could use external sensors connected to your Apple II at the time to make the robot's decisions a little more advanced. Toppo was not the only robot Androbot Inc. produced, however, as they had a whole line of upgrades and ideas after the first release. Despite many sources reporting on the company, its entire story has never been properly told from beginning to end, only in pieces. I'm here to present to you today the entire story of Androbot Inc. and its legacy. The story begins in 1981, just a few years after Nolan Bushnell created Pizza Time Theater. By now the company was doing well, and Nolan began relaxing on his executive oversight to begin new projects. He started Catalyst Technologies as one of the first venture capital groups for tech startups, though most funded projects came exclusively from Nolan and his team. By the first year, it was already funding around 10 technology firms, reaching around 20 later in the company's peak. As a response to the cultural demand of personal robots, sparked by the original Star Wars, Nolan would begin the concepts of a consumer-focused robotics company in 1982. This kicked off Androbot Inc. and its first set of hires. On October 7th of that year, Nolan would ask Doug Jones, the head designer, if he could make 25 robots in time for the Consumer Electronics Show on January 6th, 1983. Doug agreed, as long as things were done his way, and production of the first prototypes commenced. At the same time, Nolan signed a $3 million contract with Western Technologies for them to produce a small robot that could play specialized games on the Atari 2600, whom would be named Androman. Another contract was signed with Smith Engineering for a small controllable robot named Fred. The first robot designed in-house was Aza, a simple radio-controlled robot made out of cardboard and resin. This would be the first iteration of the iconic Toppo drive mechanism, having 2 wheels set at an angle and made bottom-heavy to keep itself balanced. It seems this early build also had a manually adjustable head. After this, Doug and his team would begin the proper robot. During the stressful 50 days of work, they would attend think tank sessions on the ethics of robotics and the company's responsibility as a pioneer. Despite robots like the Hero 1 already being out for a few years, Androbot was shooting for true household assistants that needed to be safe. The style of robots were made to look friendly, but not organic. During production, it was realized that the aspirations of the team was making the robot reach outside of the consumer price point. It was decided to split the product into a high-end and low-end model. The high-end robot, the collective desires and dreams of all the workers at Androbot, would be named Bob, for Brains on Board. The lower-end model, there to get a product out quickly and to test market demand, would be named Toppo. Toppo, not equipped with any of the sensors or computational power to work on its own, would be used as an opportunity for educators and programmers to create their own software for control. Software called Toppo Basic would be created for the Apple II computer as a means to interface with Toppo. This software wouldn't have any interface, and instead was a layer of registers and commands that users could create basic programs to connect with Toppo. A radio controller would connect to the Apple II and wirelessly ping Toppo to move each motor. Bob would be able to store logic internally and process decisions by its multitude of sonic sensors. It also had a heat detector under its face mesh to detect people and move towards them. It would carry 2 Intel 8086 processors and 3 megabytes of RAM, having its own operating system. Planned expandability, voice recognition, and speech would be experimented with as well. As December rolled around, the robots were entering the final stages for the show. More finalized hardware was installed, but it was still a rushed prototype for CES. 15 of these would be ready to present at the show, coming in 3 colors. But while working units could be on the show floor, it was requested a proper demonstration be done with Nolan himself. He wanted one of the bots to get him a beer on stage. This was one of Nolan's dreams for a pet robot, as before Androbot he worked with Cyan Engineering to create a little robot project called Kermit that would try to reach the same goal. Despite the workers' best efforts, the robot couldn't get the job done. The day before the show, engineers were staying up all night trying to make it work. By this point, they had made shirts for themselves labeled 1683 or Bust. CES was now here. The showroom was packed with investors and press excited for the unveiling. The audience waited anxiously for the robot on stage to move. As Nolan took the stage, he asked the robot to fetch him something. With great relief, the robot wheeled out, collected a beer, and brought it to him. Larry Kaloff, Catalyst's president at the time, stated, "The place went absolutely nuts." After the great unveiling, work would be set on the 2 robots. Toppo would be prepared and developed for launch in a few months, while Bob continued to be experimented with as the high-end model. Bob would go through a few design changes and prototypes throughout the early months of 1983. The next model after CES would gain a belt of silver decals, the removal of his front light panel, and additional lights put on his body. This one would be heavily used in marketing images for years to come. A little later, a version with a black face mesh would appear, which would be the iconic look going forward. Toppo would also see the final design changes applied, having a similar silver belt and black mesh, though distinct by the lack of golden sonar eyes. By March, Toppo would already be set to have a cameo in one of Nolan's previous endeavors. Pizza Time Theater would open a new company called Kaleidoscope to create animated cartoons starring Chuck E. Cheese. This company would be the first to create digital animation software, capable of the same feats as traditional without the ink. One of the key characters in their first film would be an unnamed set of robots borrowing the look of a gray Toppo. Integration of Androbot products into Pizza Time Theater was only just starting. In April, Toppo would begin mass production as the launch window drew near. Engineers would already begin working on the next version of Toppo in anticipation. Toppo 2 would gain the ability to speak using a voice synthesizer chip. The earliest of these ideas can be seen from the Disney Channel TV show Imagine.
At Androbot Incorporated, they make robots that take full advantage of the fact that we can't change our voices. As a matter of fact, they even talk back. Would you go and get me a Coke, please? Fetch.
Sure, anything you want.
Oh, I've been looking for this guy. I sent him on a little... yeah, I sent him on a little errand earlier.
Here's your book, Dave.
Yeah, right here will do. Stop. That's fine, thanks a lot. You can go now. That'll be all for the time being. You want anything?
Oh, well, while you're out there, Toppo,
But some pretzels.
It's clear the voice is crude and simply overlaid on top of the footage. It's also seen that the programmers were experimenting with the Apple Voice Input Module software by Voice Machine Communications. This would let them speak commands for Toppo to follow.
Can we see Toppo in action?
sure.
Left. Stop. Forward. Back. Right.
Sadly, nothing would come of this experiment for future releases. At the end of the footage, however, the first shell for a proper Toppo 2 can be spotted, which at this point had a black speaker mesh under the chin. By early May, Toppo 1 would be ready to launch, just nearly making it by the deadline. 650 units were made to start, at an asking price of $495. Advertisements to dealers began appearing throughout the month, with Androbot claiming Toppo 2 would be ready next month in June. As units headed out to stores, however, the launch sales were abysmal. Dealers would order multiple units, yet would barely be able to sell one. Stores selling to schools would have a better time, though as the months rolled by, most realized schools were their only potential buyer. 6 months in, only 125 units had been sold. Androbot began finding ways to promote Toppo 1 using their abundance of spare units. First was offering an unknown amount of Toppos in the Smile America Spell Chuck E. Cheese sweepstakes for Pizza Time Theater on June 6th. Next was sending Toppos out to Atari computer camps, which were 8-week camps teaching kids how to program in Logo. Toppo would arrive in centers across 6 states to be integrated into the program. A variation of Atari computer camps, called Chuck E. Cheese's Computer Learning Center, would debut at the 3-story Pizza Time Theater in San Jose with a Toppo of its own. This robot still lives in the store's attic to this day. The next CES was already around the corner in Chicago. Androbot would take this opportunity to publicly present Fred from Smith Engineering to consumers. Fred would essentially be a tiny Toppo, being controllable by a joystick or a program. He also had voice capabilities like the upcoming Toppo 2 and could relay information back to computer. His main trick was a special pen holder, where you could program patterns for him to draw out on the sheet below him. Despite not making it to the show, Androman from Western Technologies would debut in one of the 4 brochures from the event. His function was to move around a special game mat and scan colored pieces dotted along it. This would relay information back to the Atari console for the gameplay. 3 games were in development at the time: Androman on the Moon, a version of Clue, and an unknown 3rd game. The Androman seen in the brochure was actually a fake hollow shell, as the real Androman was still in production. Later on, he would look closer to this. Bob would also make an appearance at the show in his most recent prototype, now with the proper Bob sticker on his front.
Your humble servant.
Bob, get me a beer. Bob has been programmed to go into the kitchen and get me a beer and bring it to me in my chair.
Let's see if there are any left.
Bob walks and he talks, he sees, he thinks, he makes decisions for himself. He's going to make it as convenient for me as he can. He's going to turn so that the can is facing me.
This Coke's for you.
Bob can't really think, of course.
Very good, Bob.
But as long as you have an Andro fridge and $2,000, he can at least serve beer.
Toppo 2 would not make an appearance, but would be mentioned in the Toppo brochure as an add-on text-to-speech version of the robot. At this point, he had now been given a red glass top to his head in the prototype. After CES, Toppo 2 would not hit its June release date, disappointing retailers. The robot's complexity began to expand outside its initial talking capability. Androbot would reschedule the launch for September of that year. Bushnell had a rule for Catalyst companies to not sink any more than $300,000 into a project, but his passion with Androbot had already crossed that limit. By then, the company had already racked up $3 million in losses. It was decided to put Androbot up for public stock offerings to gain funding. Just before the auction happened, however, the high-tech market collapsed. The company had to pull from going public, and instead find willing investors to keep it afloat. Progress on Bob would halt as Toppo 2 now got ready for launch. By this point, a few more changes would occur. The red and green lights on the feet would be replaced by amber ones, and the top of the head would now become a controller. The side buttons would make Toppo 2 spin, while the others would make him go forward and back.
Left.
Near launch, his silver stickers would be replaced with black ones, making him now very distinct from his earlier counterpart. The software also changed, going from Toppo Basic to Toppo Soft. Toppo Soft used a custom version of the 4th programming language, which was nicknamed Toppo 4th, and later the Androbot control language. Toppo 2 would now use an IR transmitter rather than through radio.
While some robots work for a living, others are making their way into our homes as personal and domestic companions.
R2D2 and C3PO, new loader.
This is Toppo, created by Androbot in San Jose, and they're every bit as appealing as the androids in Star Wars.
Sweet Sweet
Manufacturers predict that within a few years, robots like these will not only entertain us with 4-part harmony, but best of all, they'll liberate us from mundane and time-consuming household chores.
Toppo 2 would launch within late November to early December at $1,000. This first run, which seemed to have been around 500 units, would have a special gold plaque on their front giving their production number alongside Nolan's signature. Toppo 1 was still marketed to consumers as Toppo, while Toppo 2 was called Toppo with Sound. Both units seemed to fare better with this launch, though sales numbers become very vague by this point. At least several hundred had sold within this period.
It's the biggest lottery jackpot in the history of North America. Some fortune hunters have consulted soothsayers, while others have turned to a robot to pick the right combination. Even robots like Toppo have their own ideas about winning the $25 million prize. The Androbot picks 6 numbers at random after running 2 million possibilities through its memory. If Toppo wins, he'll take a trip to California's Silicon Valley.
Back at Kaleidoscope, Toppo would finally make his guest appearance in the Chuck E. Cheese cartoon entitled The Christmas That Almost Wasn't. Sadly, due to all of Nolan's financial issues, the final product had to be rushed. The animation was so cut down that it was basically colored storyboard, which ruined the potential to showcase the technology.
It sure was a smart idea of yours, Chuck, to get these 2 robots to pull our sled.
Oh, yeah, with these 2 guys, we're going to be at the North Pole handing Santa your Christmas list in no time.
In an interesting turn, Kaleidoscope and its software was sold to Lucasfilm later on and became the computer division of that company. The employees of that division would make a corporate spin-off in 1986 to form Pixar. Back in November of 1983, Androbot would make a deal with a company in the UK called Prism Consumer Products to sell Toppo 2 units. The initial launch would just include the Apple II software, but plans were made to have versions ready later on for the BBC Micro and the ZX Spectrum. A Commodore 64 release for both countries would also be worked on by Prism. In February of 1984, a Toppo 2 would appear as the winning prize of a graphics drawing contest in Sinclair User magazine. The UK Toppo would use a Toppo 1 body with a Toppo 2 head, having a speaker mesh cut out in the lower chest with the Prism logo placed on it. Paul Douthwaite would ultimately win the prize a few months later. Prism would launch Toppo 2 in March, alongside promoting Fred to follow soon after, though it is unclear how many units were made and sold. Another version of UK Toppo 2 can be seen later in June with a proper full Toppo 2 body, but at this time with a large Prism print on its front. Back to earlier in the year, both companies would begin planning on accessories for Toppo to use in factory work, such as a barcode scanner, a bump detector, or an arm. This project would lead to a contract with Kodak, planning to produce 75 robots capable of delivering parts on an assembly line. Androbot would decide to move the stagnant and unreleased Bob project in this direction, naming the new bot Bob XA for Expandable Androbot. Bob XA would replace the unique body shells for a black box with standard wheels. Most internal things from the original Bob would still carry over, such as the Intel processor and dual software programs. An Andro lift would be designed for it to lift objects from the front, alongside a barcode scanner for detecting objects. Androbot would plan to be at the first International Personal Robot Congress and Exposition on April 13th of that year, where they planned to show off Toppo 2, Fred, and Bob XA. To fit in Bob with the Androbot style, a custom bot for the showcase will be made with a grafted-on Toppo 1 head and sonar eyes. This special bot has since been nicknamed Bowtie Bob. Even 2 years in, the grabbing beard trick was still being shown, though now with the ability to lift a six-pack on a stool. Nolan also attended the event as a speaker for the Future of Personal Robots panel. Many other interesting robots were showcased at the event, which may become subjects of future videos. Bowtie Bob would continue to make appearances in photos of the headquarters, where he would go through a few changes such as the removal of the sonar eyes, an added drink tray, and eventually a button layout on the head. During Bob XA's production, however, the engineers could not get him to work within Kodak's spec for the contract, and the deal was cancelled. The company would have to pay $80,000 for a patent infringement regarding canted drive system for Toppo. Around the same time, it was discovered that the marketing department had not been returning calls for 2 whole months, resulting in 0 sales. After firing the marketing manager and fixing the problem, still no sales happened for another 4 months. In June, Cicerex, one of Androbot's original financiers, would give an undisclosed amount for a stake in the company, keeping it afloat for a while longer. By August, the company would attempt a final push on Bob and Toppo. Throughout the year, a Toppo 3 had been created and was able to be assembled with 2 shells. Toppo's fold-out arms would also be replaced with slide-in trays for drinks and general items. Everything else was the same as Toppo 2, though now with an identifiable mark of 4 dots around the speaker.
Forward. Stop.
This version would still not be ready for production just yet, so Bob XA was focused on instead. This focus would also lead to the severing of Prism from receiving any more robots for overseas distribution. Prism would try to negotiate to manufacture its own Androbot products for the UK market, but this would fall through. Bob would be set to launch in September in 2 configurations for $2,500 and $4,000. While ads were sent out to potential buyers, the company was also looking for capital partners to invest in Bob's deployment, which already had various parts for around 700 units. The only firm to respond would be Sanrio, which had its team fly over to California to tour the facilities. A Bob, presumably Bowtie Bob, was the group's guide who led them through the rooms while commenting about the company. Androbot employees were watching the tour on a CCTV with no sound. At one point, Bob had to go down a long hallway, and due to an automatic idle sequence that would happen if Bob didn't speak, he began to whistle to buy the time. When this happened, all the Sanrio employees stopped, looked at each other, stunned, and stormed out the building. Everyone watching the TV was clueless as to what happened. Nolan later called the company together in the back parking lot to give a speech to the marketing department, explaining that if you have Japanese clients on tour, maybe don't whistle the tune to The Bridge on the River Kwai. A short time later, Fred would finally make his debut on the market. 300 units would be produced, but only some managed to sell to interested schools. Prism would also offer an unknown amount of Freds in the UK. In November, after no sales of Bob XA and short numbers from Fred, the employees would be assembled once again and told the company was folding. 100 employees would be reduced to 15, just enough to manage the sales of Toppo 3 and Fred. The company's recent 4th president, John Peers, would say, "We've got to get a dose of common sense into this business. The robots do so much. Why are we promising more?" Only 2 developments remained by this point, Western Technology's Androman project and Doug Jones's vacuum robot project, akin to the modern-day Roomba. The first half of 1985 would have these projects continue while remaining stock attempted to be sold. By that point, it was too late, and Nolan listed the company for sale in the New York Times. A few parties were interested, but none went for the purchase. Nolan would keep the company name and copyrights, while selling the patents, hardware, software, and remaining stock on auction a few months later. By its death, it had racked in over $15 million in debt from Bushnell and his financiers. Despite Androbot's death, it had already taken another form months prior through Axelon, one of Nolan's defunct pocket terminal companies. Nolan continued his robotic work through smaller, more affordable toys, and it was a hit. Axelon's first new product was actually a complete rework of Fred into Andy the Personality Robot. Andy would essentially be a miniaturized, cheap Toppo, being controllable by a joystick, as well as allowing user-made programs to let him move around. Axelon would continue to make even more famous toys like the Petster, alongside still prototyping with Bob XA, but that will have to be saved for part 2. Now that's where the story ends, but we're not done yet though. As this is an archival series, there's still many things unknown and lost media to be found. Let's start with what happened since the companies died. Toppo's legacy has mainly formed as being the mascot of the 80s home robot boom, as Androbot would try and put him on as many magazine covers as they could. Nolan's name being attached to the company also helped with that. Despite that, nothing has happened with the IP for over 30 years. It's most likely Nolan still owns the copyright and the trademarks, but no nostalgic t-shirts, merchandise, or any spin-offs have happened. As for the remaining robots, there's definitely a good amount of Toppos that appear online. There were 650 Toppo, so it's the easiest to get. There were around 500 Toppo 2s, but not all of them made it out of the warehouse before dissolving, so it seems like there's about a 1-to-2 ratio when these pop up on eBay. Toppo 3s are ridiculously rare. There's no confirmed count, and the largest number of them in one single picture was 15. Only 3 publicly exist right now. 2 in collectors' hands, and 1 at the Personal Computer Museum, which is a downgraded version that doesn't have the voice module. Bob XAs are in a similar vague state. They had parts for 700, but none actually sold, and only a few were fully built. There was a lot of stock in the warehouse of various robots, but nobody knows what happened to them after the sale. Publicly, I think a few units are known. UK Toppo 2s are next in the rarity until we get more information. As far as we know, there's only 5 out there. All the Bobs that came before Bob XA were only prototype units, and at maximum there were only 4 in one room. None of them have surfaced in modern day. Androman also only has single units. It's a little unclear for Fred. About 100 were sold to schools, and 300 were made, but it's unclear how many of those working units were repurposed for Andy. Andy is a completely different story though. 2,300 were made and sold. They actually ran out of Fred plastic shells within 2 months and had to find another toy to make. Out of all these robots, Andy is definitely the easiest to get your hands on, even if he isn't technically from Androbot. Now onto the current state of archival. Out of all the niche companies to discuss, this first one is definitely the most well documented. It was a company founded by Nolan Bushnell about putting robots in your home, so there are naturally a ton of newspaper reports, promotional material, interviews, and other such. There was also a good amount of effort made in the early 2000s to document these things beforehand. We've got 3 main people to thank this for. First is Richard Rowland, who compiled most of the info we know about today. He went out and contacted tons of Androbot employees to get exclusive info and photos, which can be read from his website, smallrobot.com. Note that some pages are exclusive to an older version of the site on GeoCities, so you'll have to use the Wayback Machine to see everything. Next is the Old Robot, who worked with Roland to archive more images and PDFs on his own site, theoldrobots.com. If you really want to dive into the rabbit hole, there were many more vintage robots made throughout the mid-20th century, and we may dive into those companies in future videos. And finally was Vincent Kessels, who documented the boards, schematics, and code of the robots. He's the reason we have a disassembled ROM dump of some of the boards. So we have a lot of the info, but what needs to be still researched and looked into? Well, for software, we do have the Toppo 1 and Toppo 2 Apple II programs, alongside the Androman on the Moon game, but everything else is lost. This includes Toppo Teach, an application for controlling Toppo with a joystick rather than programming, Toppo Basic for the Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and BBC Micro, Axelon Andy software, Fred's communicator software for both the Apple II and Commodore 64, TopoSoft for the IBM, Androman on the Moon for the ColecoVision, the prototype Toppo voice recognition software built off of AVIM, Bob's ACL Programmer, Bob's Standard Function software, the Bob XA Programmer, and the Bob XA User Interface. There also aren't many simulated devices for Toppo's radio and IR communications if you attempt to run Toppo Basic or TopoSoft through an Apple II emulator. Both programs will refuse to boot until they detect the devices. If you actually manage to get a Toppo, you'll need to also have a real Apple II with the correct communicator device to even do anything, which is why you don't see any videos of people using their Toppos nowadays. Better emulation and attempts to make modern software for controlling Toppos would help bring them back to life. Back in 1997, there was an attempt to do this called ToppoScript 2. It was created by Thomas Cantrell for Windows 95. It was actually found during the writing of this script, so this might be an option for now. As for boards, there are still tons and tons of EEPROMs that haven't been dumped yet from Androbot owners. Most critically is the lack of anything from Bob or Bob XA, or the voice module for Toppo. Toppo sounds very similar to Atari SAM, but has a custom voice EEPROM and a slightly different chip to the Commodore that has not been identified yet. The most complete set of documents and parts is Toppo 2, but anyone wanting to build a reproduction doesn't currently have the resources to do so. Lastly, another critical area is footage.
What strange looking creatures. Oh, I know. You're a human.
I found a lot of new sources for this video, and there is a playlist in the description of all of them in full, but there's still shockingly little. Only 28 videos so far. Finally, for those especially intrigued and want to look into further things that couldn't be discussed in this video, I present some other deep dives you can do. First is absolutely Randy Robot. This is a bootlegged Toppo created by a former Disney animatronics worker that tried to outcompete what Androbot was doing, including adding a radio transmitter for alerting police for an emergency, identifying users by facial recognition, and interfacing only through speech. I have a huge report on it with all the insane details below. Next is the colored Toppo mystery. During the production of Toppo 2, a bunch of colored Toppo 1 units were made, allegedly in red, brown, green, blue, and gray. So far, we've only found pictures of the blue and gray Toppo, though this black and white photo also features an unknown color. Another for UK viewers is the mystery of the UK Toppo 2. Prism seemed to have worked with Androbot even up to the release of Bob XA, so there might be some more stuff to uncover there, especially finding all the ported software. Lastly, there's the dive into other robotics manufacturers of the time. The most notable jumping point is Heathkit's Hero 1, which debuted in October of 1979. There's also Axelon's robots made after the Androbot closure, Tomi's Omnibot 2000, and all the different robots listed on theoldrobots.com that you can get attached to. I'm already planning on talking about some of these in the future. For this series, I want to make sure that there's a place for others to continue my research if this topic has interested them. This took me months of research, but the amount of man-hours of research multiple people, or even a community could do, can bring so much more lost media to light. That's why all my research and sources are documented on the Archive of Vintage Robotics and Technology Company's Wikipedia site. This will be the hub for people to collaborate and dive deeper into these topics. There's full pages dedicated to things I haven't discussed here, and I hope more information in lost media can be uncovered this way, and I'll be sure to do a part 2 if more stuff is found. I already have some sections in the work for future episodes. I hope you have fun diving deeper into these obscure topics. You're some of the first to hear about this company in a long time. If you like this video, consider supporting me on Patreon like these awesome people here. I'll see you next time.